Welcome to RPG PhD. I'm Dr. Ben, and today we're exploring how game mechanics don't just support storytelling in tabletop role-playing games, they shape it. In this episode, we're looking at how rules and systems influence the emotional tone, pacing, and dramatic arc of your game. From Dungeons & Dragons combat-focused structure to the psychological weight of stress and trauma in Blades in the Dark, mechanics guide not just what players can do, but what kinds of stories naturally unfold at the table. We'll unpack key ideas like Ludonarrative Harmony, Emergent narrative, and player agency, using examples from Fate, Apocalypse World, and more. And toward the end, I'll break down practical tips for game masters and designers looking to align their mechanics with the kinds of experiences they want to create, whether that's tension, moral conflict, or emotional resolution. So let's dig into how mechanics can drive the story, not just the stats. Before diving into examples, it's important to define some key terms and concepts that will be used throughout the discussion. These concepts come from game design theory and narrative studies, and they help us articulate how mechanics and story interact in games. At its core, storytelling in tabletop role-playing games is the process of creating a narrative through play. Unlike a novel or film where a single author or director crafts a fixed story, a role-playing game story emerges collaboratively. The game master describes the world and supporting characters, the players describe their characters' actions, and together they improvise a plot. This collaborative narrative can be pre-planned, a written adventure or campaign storyline, or it can be largely improvised and emergent. In either case, storytelling in tabletop role-playing games is interactive. It responds to players' decisions and the randomness of dice rolls. It's important to note that the narrative isn't just the spoken words of the game master. It includes the sequence of events, the character arcs, the conflicts and resolutions that occur during the game sessions. In a well-run game, everyone at the table contributes to this narrative, and the players feel like protagonists in a story that unfolds uniquely for them. Mechanics are the rules and systems that structure how the game is played. They determine what players can and cannot do, how conflicts are resolved, and what consequences follow from character actions. In other words, mechanics are the methods of interaction with the game world and the procedures that translate those interactions into outcomes. For example, a mechanic might be rolling a 20-sided die to see if an attack hits, or spending a point from a resource pool to activate a special ability. These include things like turn-taking structure, combat rules, skill check systems, resource management, and so on. Mechanics are what make a game rather than free-form make-believe. They provide consistency and impartial resolution, and ideally they reinforce the game's themes. Throughout this video, we will see that mechanics are not neutral. They have a profound influence on the tone and focus of the story that gets told. Good mechanics engage players with the narrative by giving their choices weight and connecting to the story's stakes, while misaligned mechanics might encourage players to act in ways that undermine the narrative. For example, if a rule rewards behavior that doesn't make sense in the story's context. A critical concept in game studies is ludonarrative dissonance, which refers to a conflict between a game's mechanics, ludo from Latin ludus meaning play or game, and its narrative themes. The term was originally coined in the context of video games, but it applies equally to tabletop role-playing games. Ludonarrative dissonance is the tension created when a game's mechanics are incongruent with the themes of the story. In other words, if what the rules encourage the players to do contradicts the kind of story the game is trying to tell, the result is a jarring disconnect. This mismatch between story and gameplay is immersion breaking, or at least it can be. In tabletop role-playing games, you might see ludonarrative dissonance when, for instance, a supposed horror game's rules make the player characters far too powerful and unafraid. Or when a game about political intrigue ends up resolving every conflict with combat rolls because the mechanics don't really support negotiation. As one tabletop RPG commentary puts it, if the mechanics of a horror game make players feel powerful rather than vulnerable, Or if a game about diplomacy revolves all its conflicts with fighting roles, a dissonance is formed that works against the intended experience. Such dissonance can break immersion and weaken the emotional impact of the game. The flip side of this concept is sometimes called Ludonarrative Harmony, or simply consistency. This is when the mechanics and the narrative reinforce each other, working in concert to deliver a cohesive experience. In a game with Ludonarrative Harmony, every die roll and rule is part of the storytelling. Within a tabletop role-playing game, that's when the mechanics of the game actively support the emotional beats and themes of play. For example, a horror role-playing game with rules that make characters feel fragile and terrified, perhaps by limiting resources or forcing hard choices for survival, would exhibit harmony between its gameplay and its horror narrative. We will explore case studies of both dissonance and harmony as we examine specific games. Striving for ludonarrative harmony is a key goal when designing for impact. It ensures that players are not pulled in opposite directions by the story versus the rules. Emergent narrative is the kind of story that arises organically during play, rather than being pre-written or plotted out in advance. Unlike a novel or tightly scripted campaign, an emergent story unfolds moment by moment, shaped by player choices, mechanical outcomes, and the dynamic responses of the game master. Even in games with planned arcs, some of the most memorable moments happen spontaneously, born from a lucky roll, a creative action, or an unexpected chain reaction between game systems. In tabletop role-playing games, this type of storytelling is often the norm. A GM might introduce a minor NPC, but if the players latch onto them, that NPC could become central to the story. Systems like Dungeon World lean into this by encouraging game masters to play to find out what happens, embracing spontaneity over scripted beats. Mechanics fuel emergent stories. Random tables, dice rolls, and procedural rules introduce surprises that players then weave into the fiction. Our brains naturally connect events into meaningful patterns, a phenomenon known as apophenia, so unrelated outcomes can become part of a compelling story. Maybe a string of bad rolls results in a tragic character death, or a resource scarcity rule forces a moral dilemma. These weren't planned, but become defining moments because the group internalizes them as meaningful parts of the story. Emergent narrative gives players a deep sense of ownership and discovery, as no one, not even the game master, knows what will happen next. For designers, encouraging this means building open-ended mechanics that create interesting problems rather than prescribing outcomes. Want to dive deeper in how emergent narrative works and how to design for it? You can check out my video linked below. There's a full lecture on the topic. The concept of diegesis comes from literary and film theory, referring to the narrative world of the story, the diegetic world, as opposed to elements that exist outside the story. In a role-playing game context, diegetic elements are things that exist within the fictional world of the game, whereas non-diegetic elements are those that exist only at the player or real-world level. For example, in a movie, the characters can hear diegetic sounds, like a radio playing in a scene, but not the non-diegetic soundtrack music that the audience hears. In tabletop role-playing games, we can similarly classify mechanics and information as diegetic or not. A character's height, weight, and equipment are diegetic. They exist in the game world, and the character knows about them. On the other hand, a character's experience points or a metagame resource like a hero point might be non-diegetic. The players track those, but the characters don't know I have 5 XP or I can spend a fate point. Diegetic versus non-diegetic is an important distinction when designing narrative mechanics. If a mechanic is diegetic, it means the characters can perceive it or discuss it in the fiction. For instance, in Dungeons & Dragons, alignment, good versus evil, law versus chaos, can be considered diegetic in many settings. There are spells like Detect Evil that literally sense a creature's alignment, making it an objective part of the world. That means alignment isn't just a role-playing guideline, it's real in the game's universe. By contrast, in a game like Fate, the concept of fate points and aspects is largely non-diegetic. A character doesn't know that they have an aspect like strong as an ox written on their sheet that they can invoke. That's a player-level abstraction used to influence the story. Bridging diegetic and non-diegetic elements is a major part of role-playing game design. Some designers prefer to keep mechanics in-world as much as possible to maintain immersion. For example, spell slots in D&D are somewhat diegetic. A wizard might say, I'm low on magical energy, which reflects the spell slot limit, and characters in-world might understand the concept of limited daily magic. Others don't mind a clear separation where players step out of the diegesis to use meta mechanics, like spending a narrative token to change a scene. Diegesis is all about what is happening in the story world versus what's happening at the table, and both levels can impact the narrative. A non-diegetic conversation tool, for example, something that can signal discomfort, can shape the kind of story that is told by removing certain content, even though it's entirely outside the fiction. Similarly, a diegetic mechanic, like a magical geese, an oath spell, might force a character to behave in a certain way, story-wise, because that's how the world works. We see examples of both approaches, and we can discuss how they affect player immersion and emotional engagement. With these terms defined, storytelling, mechanics, ludonarrative, in terms of harmony and dissonance, emergent narrative, and diegesis, we have a tool for analyzing how different tabletop role-playing games use their rules to shape the narrative experience. Next, let's explore several game systems and highlight the ways their mechanics drive emotional and psychological storytelling. Different systems take very different approaches to marrying mechanics with narratives. Some games use traditional combat-focused rules that players and game masters then adapt to tell many kinds of stories. Other games build their entire rule set around supporting a specific type of narrative or emotional experience. In this section, we'll look at a few notable systems, from the venerable Dungeons & Dragons to innovative indie designs, and examine how their mechanics influence the storytelling experience. Along the way, we'll call out examples of mechanics that enhance storytelling, as well as those that can sometimes hinder it. Dungeons & Dragons. Tradition, combat, and alignment. Dungeons & Dragons, the most iconic of the tabletop role-playing games, evolved from wargaming and centers its mechanics on combat, treasure, and character progression. Its core rules, classes with combat abilities, hit points, damage rolls, and spell slots, strongly support action-adventure stories about heroic battles and monster slaying. At least 5e does. While D&D can tell many kinds of stories, its mechanics naturally steer play toward combat-focused narratives. XP is often tied to defeating enemies, and most classes are built around combat abilities, which reinforces the so-called murder hobo playstyle. Social and narrative mechanics exist, but are less developed, meaning non-combat storytelling requires some extra effort from the game master and the players. From a ludonarrative standpoint, Dungeons & Dragons can create dissonance when groups aim for stories outside of combat. Running a political intrigue game, for instance, can be difficult because the mechanics prioritize combat over negotiation or subtlety. While game masters can improvise, the rules offer limited support for complex social dynamics, often nudging players back toward fighting. The same applies to horror. As characters grow more powerful, it's hard to maintain fear or vulnerability. When mechanics emphasize heroic resilience, they can undercut the tension essential to non-combat genres, leading to a mismatch between story and system. D&D's alignment system, the 9-point grid of lawful, chaotic, and good and evil, is designed to define a character's moral stance and can serve as a quick role-playing guide. While it can inspire tension between characters with differing values, it's often criticized as too rigid for nuanced storytelling. Morality is complex, but alignment tends to box characters into simplified roles. This can limit player choices and lead to conflicts with the game master over what a good or lawful character would do. It works best in clear-cut good versus evil tales, But in morally gray narratives, it can feel restrictive. Rather than guiding players through ethical dilemmas, alignment can become a blunt tool that oversimplifies character motivation. D&D has become more story-friendly over time, especially in 5th edition, which introduced ideals, bonds, and flaws as role-playing prompts, along with the inspiration mechanic that rewards narrative-consistent play. These features aim to connect character behavior with mechanical incentives, nudging the game toward Ludonarrative Harmony. However, they remain lightweight, and D&D's core still emphasizes tactical combat. Its storytelling shines either by fully embracing its action-focused rules or by players and GMs working around them to prioritize character-driven narratives. Ultimately, Dungeons & Dragons excels at heroic fantasy, but often needs adaptation to support other tones like mystery or moral drama. Fate, aspects, and narrative agency. Unlike D&D, Fate is built from the ground up to support narrative-first play. Its core mechanic revolves around aspects, short descriptive phrases about characters or scenes, like veteran soldier with a haunted past. These aspects are more than flavor, they're tied directly to the fate point economy. Players spend fate points to invoke aspects for bonuses or accept compels from the game master to introduce narrative complications in exchange for points. This creates a constant push-pull between drama and control, encouraging players to embrace storytelling twists. Fate's system gives players narrative agency by rewarding character-driven decisions. Playing to your aspects, like risking your life for your little brother, not only deepens roleplay, but also fuels your ability to influence future events. Players can even spend fate points to add story elements, like knowing a helpful NPC, turning the game into a shared storytelling experience. The result is strong Ludonarrative harmony, where mechanics and narratives reinforce each other. Emotionally, Fate encourages players to personalize their characters, making the mechanics a vehicle for exploring relationships, trauma, and ideals. This can create real investment and drama as the system helps bring those themes to the forefront. While some may find its abstract meta approach unfamiliar, Fate's design shows how mechanics can directly support emergent character-driven stories. Blades in the Dark: Stress, Trauma, and Consequences. Blades in the Dark is built to tell stories of high-risk heists, personal sacrifice, and the psychological toll of criminal life. Its core mechanics, especially stress and trauma, directly support that tone. Players spend stress to push themselves or resist consequences, creating dramatic moments where survival comes at a cost. If stress exceeds the limit, the character suffers trauma, forcing them out of the scene and leaving a lasting emotional scar, like becoming cold or reckless. These mechanics encourage emergent character arcs. A daring thief becomes jaded over time, not through scripting, but through gameplay. The tension builds visibly as stress accumulates, creating constant pressure and hard choices. Do you risk trauma to save the mission? The decision is yours, and the consequences are real. Blades also supports narrative through tools like progress clocks, ticking threats, flashbacks, spend stress to establish past prep, and fiction-first outcomes. Every role translates directly into story developments. Even the engagement role launches each mission in medias res, shaping the story's tone from the outset. While the trauma mechanic may feel abstract at first, most players find it heightens immersion, capturing the emotional wear of the world. Like the game Dread, which uses a Jenga tower to build suspense, Blades internalizes that escalating tension through stress. The result is a system that aligns perfectly with its themes: gritty drama, consequence, and transformation. Every mechanic reinforces the story, making Ludonarrative Harmony not just a goal, but a gameplay standard. Apocalypse World moves and fiction-first drama. Apocalypse World revolutionized RPG design by introducing the Powered by the Apocalypse framework, which emphasizes fiction-first play. Its central mechanic, the move, ties specific narrative actions to dice rolls. For example, Seize by Force triggers only when the fiction calls for it, and outcomes always affect the story. There's no dead roll. A 10 plus means success, 7 through 9 is a success with a cost, and 6 or less invites game master driven complication. This structure builds Ludonarrative Harmony. The rules consistently reflect the world's themes of scarcity, danger, and hard choices. Even failure moves the narrative forward, creating tension and surprise. Game masters, called MCs, also have scripted moves to respond narratively, such as separate them or inflict harm, maintaining the story's pace and tone. Because moves cover not just combat, but also emotions and relationships like read a person or seduce or manipulate, the system supports a wide range of stories. Social insight and personal drama have real mechanical weight. The result is emotionally rich play where outcomes shape character arcs and future scenes. The 2d6 system also reinforces unpredictability. Even partial successes often introduces a twist. Players make bold choices because even failure is dramatic and engaging. This fosters emotional investment and shared storytelling, as one move's result often sets the stage for the next. Each Powered by the Apocalypse game tailors its moves to match its genre. Apocalypse World is gritty and raw, Monster Hearts is emotional and hormonal, Dungeon World more heroic. Because mechanics are written in narrative terms, dissonance is rare. In short, Apocalypse World proved that mechanics can serve story first and do it powerfully. Apocalypse World and Powered by the Apocalypse system excel at blending mechanics with narrative. The game's moves become a shared language for storytelling, like an improvised script shaped by dice. It proves that rules don't need to be complex to be immersive. They just need to serve the fiction. Every mechanic drives pace, tension, and consequence. The Powered by the Apocalypse model's success across genres, urban fantasy, teen drama, romance, noir, shows its flexibility in delivering emotionally rich stories. For game designers, the key takeaway is this: define what your game is truly about and craft mechanics that make players feel that theme every step of the way. That's the foundation of Ludonarrative Harmony and of stories players will remember. Beyond the major examples, many tabletop role-playing games offer unique mechanics that blend rules with storytelling in interesting and powerful ways. Call of Cthulhu uses a sanity mechanic tied to cosmic horror. As characters confront eldritch terrors, failed sanity checks cause mental breakdowns, phobias, madness, or worse, creating a grim narrative arc of psychological decay that mirrors the genre's core themes. Burning Wheel focuses on beliefs, instincts, and traits. Players write their characters' core motivations, and pursuing them earns Artha, a narrative currency. This rewards deep role-playing and moral choices, while its fight of words mechanic gives social conflict the same weight as combat, encouraging diverse storytelling. Fiasco is a game masterless story game about dark comedy and disaster structured like a movie. Players frame scenes, assign dice to determine good or bad outcomes, and introduce chaos mid-game through a tilt. The mechanics ensure rising tension and a climactic downfall, making storytelling the game's core engine. Dread replaces dice with a Jenga tower. Every pull raises real-life tension, and knocking it over means character doom. The physical mechanic mirrors the in-story fear, creating visceral suspense and perfect alignment between player emotion and narrative tone. Genesis, Fantasy Flight's Star Wars RPG, uses custom symbol dice that generate results like success with threat or failure with advantage. This keeps every roll narratively rich, blending outcomes into yes but or no and style twists that drive story momentum and creativity. These systems show that storytelling and mechanics can be intertwined through dice, cards, physical elements, or narrative prompts. The lesson is simple but powerful. Every mechanic shapes the story, so designers and game masters should choose or create rules that support the emotional and narrative experience they want to evoke. Next, we'll look at how you can apply these principles to design or tweak your own systems for greater narrative impact. Game designers and game masters have the power to shape players' experiences by how they implement mechanics. Whether you're creating a new game system from scratch or just house ruling and tweaking an existing one for your campaign, you can use that power to reinforce the story or the type of story and the feelings you want to evoke. And this section will provide a structured how-to set of best practices for aligning mechanics with narrative and emotional goals, as well as some potential pitfalls to watch out for. This advice is aimed both at designers crafting systems and rule sets and game masters who often modify rules or create subsystems for their games. Think of it as a toolkit for making sure the game's rules serve the story you're collectively creating rather than fighting against it. First of all, start with your narrative goals. Decide what kind of story you want to tell. Swashbuckling adventure, tragic horror, political intrigue, and identify the emotional beats you want players to experience. Hope, betrayal, tension, catharsis. Then design or choose mechanics that reinforce those beats. If moral tension is central, include mechanics that force tough choices. If collaboration matters, build in shared resources or combo maneuvers. Align mechanics with theme. Avoid ludonarrative dissonance, where mechanics encourage behaviors that clash with the story's tone. For survival horror, don't reward monster kills with XP. Reward stealth or problem solving. Make sure every major mechanic encourages the kind of play that fits your story's tone. Tweak or skip dissonant rules. Random encounters that derail a political plot, for example. Empower player agency. Let players meaningfully shape the story. This can be mechanical, like spending points to introduce details, like fate, or procedural, encouraging improvisation with yes and or yes but approaches. Mechanics that let players world build, create NPCs, or use skills in narrative ways foster deep engagement and co-authorship. Tie mechanics to character and emotion. Mechanics should reflect who characters are and what they care about. Ideals, bonds, traumas, relationships. Track internal states like stress, fear, or hope if those emotions matter. Reward role-playing personal goals or overcoming fears. A character afraid of water earns XP for braving a storm or a river. This deepens immersion and reinforces emotional stakes. Build in consequences. Let player choices echo. Use mechanics like progress clocks, reputation systems, or lingering injuries to ensure actions leave a mark. Design fallout or downtime phases where consequences can play out. This reinforces themes like cause and effect, responsibility, and moral tension. Use uncertainty and risk for drama. Uncertainty fuels tension. Use partial successes, critical failures, and other unpredictable mechanics to create dynamic outcomes. Yes, but sorts of results. Tools like countdown clocks or fortune in the middle rolls let players narrate dramatic failures and raise stakes, adding narrative twists without bogging down gameplay. Encourage collaboration. Design mechanics that invite every player to contribute. Let players frame scenes, assist each other mechanically, or spend resources to shape the world. As a game master, prompt quieter players with narrative questions that give them creative input. Ensure that every role, the hacker, the healer, whatever it might be, has meaningful spotlight mechanics. Playtest story for impact. Test whether mechanics create the emotional tone and story flow you're aiming for. Ask, are the players engaged? Do the rules support drama or slow it down? If something doesn't land, like ignored motivation systems or overly punishing failure, adjust incentives or simplify complexity to keep the focus on story. Think about including consent and conversation tools. Emotional depth thrives on trust and clear communication, so use conversation tools or session zero discussions or other type tools to collaboratively set boundaries and expectations. While these tools operate outside the fiction, they enhance storytelling by fostering a space where everyone feels comfortable engaging with intense themes. Also, consider accessibility in different engagement styles to ensure all players can participate meaningfully, regardless of experience or needs. Keep mechanics lightweight during play. Avoid rules that interrupt flow. Design intuitive systems or provide quick reference tools. If complex mechanics are necessary, perhaps for a gritty tone, streamline their use. As a game master, don't hesitate to hand wave or condense rules if they're slowing the story. Focus on pacing and emotional beats over technical precision. Good narrative-focused design means ensuring that playing the game well creates a great story. When mechanics naturally lead to drama, dilemma, and discovery, players feel like co-authors in something meaningful. Here's some common pitfalls in narrative-focused design that you might want to avoid. Following best practices helps mechanics and story support each other, but knowing what not to do is just as important. So here's a couple things to think about. Mechanics overload. Too many complex rules can drown out the story. Crunchy systems are not bad, but complexity should serve the narrative. Avoid unnecessary bookkeeping, hunger, or thirst in a fast-paced adventure unless it reinforces the game's themes. Agency-killing punishments. Don't overuse mechanics that shut players down. Things like long paralysis, forced mind control. Instead of "you can't act," offer narrative complications that still let players participate. Perhaps they're restrained but can still speak or strategize. Keep players involved even under duress. Misaligned rewards. Be careful what you incentivize. If your story is about diplomacy, but XP comes from combat kills, players will lean toward violence. Ensure rewards reflect narrative goals. Character growth, problem solving, or emotional beats, not just mechanical victory. Ignoring player feedback. If a mechanic is unfun or distressing for someone at the table, adjust it. Even great ideas on paper might not work in practice. Always prioritize the player's experience and don't hesitate to revise rules that don't land well or that disrupt flow. One player spotlight syndrome. Avoid systems that let one character dominate scenes. So the high charisma face or a min-max fighter. Build in opportunities for everyone to contribute. Assist roles, shared spotlight scenes, or mechanics that reward collaboration and ensemble play. Over-reliance on randomness in key moments. Important story beats should not hinge on one fluke roll. Use multi-step resolutions, fate points, or second wins to build drama and ensure meaningful climaxes. A little randomness adds tension. Too much can flatten the story's payoff. So by steering clear of these pitfalls, you can create space for mechanics to enhance, not hinder, narrative flow, especially if that's what you're aiming for. Combine this with the earlier best practices and you'll foster richer, more emotionally resonant play. Agency is the player's sense of control over their character and influence on the story. It's a core driver of emotional investment. When players feel their choices matter, they care more deeply about the outcomes. Mechanics that support agency offer meaningful, non-binary choices. In Powered by the Apocalypse games, for example, a roll of 7 to 9 often forces players to choose a consequence. They guide the twist, not just suffer it. Fate's Compel system gives players the choice to accept a complication for a reward or resist it with a cost. These decisions give players narrative control, not just reactive outcomes. Branching storylines reinforce agency. For example, a reputation system where choices affect faction standing shows that decisions reshape the world. Players may feel pride in forging peace or guilt after choosing power at a moral cost. These emotional responses come from seeing their impact reflected in the narrative. Mechanics can also honor sacrifice and self-determination. A system that enables a player to spend resources or hit points to perform a heroic last stand makes that choice feel earned and powerful. Such scenes often create lasting emotional memories for the whole table. Psychological agency ties to autonomy and competence. Players feel like problem solvers and storytellers. Even failure can affirm agency if it results from a player's choice and has meaningful narrative fallout. A good system ensures that every player has ways to make impactful decisions, whether through unique abilities, team strategies, or mission choices. In short, mechanics that support agency make players feel empowered and emotionally connected, whether they succeed or fail, because the story is shaped by their choices. Consequences give player choices weight and emotional depth. Without them, stories can feel flat. Nothing matters if actions don't lead to change. Mechanics that track or reflect outcomes like wanted levels, reputation shifts, or curses raise stakes and immerse players in the impact of their decisions. Moral tension arises when mechanics challenge characters' ethics. Vampire the Masquerade's humanity score punishes immoral acts by pushing the character toward monstrosity. These systems force players to weigh actions. Is the power gained worth the moral cost? Structured morality mechanics often make players reflect more deeply than free-form choices. And even without formal systems, consistent world reactions reinforce moral consequence. If a villain spared by the party returns to wreak havoc, the guilt hits harder. Games like Pendragon track shifting character traits over time, becoming more reckless, letting behavior shape mechanical identity, externalizing emotional growth or decline. Importantly, players should also be able to address and resolve consequences. Blades in the Dark lets characters reduce heat or clear their name during downtime, giving them tools to atone or repair damage. This adds narrative tension and resolution. We messed up, but here's how we try to fix it. Death is the ultimate consequence and should serve the story. Random, anticlimactic deaths can feel unfair, but when death is dramatic and mechanically supported, something like a final heroic act before dying, it can be cathartic and incredibly memorable. In short, consequence mechanics intensify narrative stakes, evoke emotion, and shape character arcs, turning gameplay into meaningful storytelling. After tension and struggle, catharsis provides emotional release and resolution. In tabletop role-playing games where players are both actors and audience, mechanics can help deliver that satisfying payoff. Boss fights and final showdowns are mechanical climaxes, longer, harder, and often more intense. When players pour all of their resources into a victory and finally win, the emotional eruption at the table is catharsis in action. Escalating mechanics like a doom track or multi-phase boss signal the stakes and make the payoff sweeter. Character arc conclusions are another powerful release. Systems like Fate, The One Ring, and Powered by the Apocalypse often include epilogues or end-of-career milestones. Even a simple prompt, what does your character do after all of this? This invites reflection, closure, and even emotion. Downtime mechanics offer emotional decompression. In Blades in the Dark, characters indulge vices to relieve stress, a mechanical stand-in for processing trauma. Horror games might offer sanity recovery or tragic post-scenario fallout. Even a Dungeons & Dragons Return to Town session can function as a breather and narrative reset. Catharsis isn't always joyful. It can be tragic, too. A heroic death or even a total party kill can provide meaningful closure when built up properly through mechanics like foreshadow doom or irreversible consequences. The key is that it feels earned. Reflection enhances release. Debriefs or epilogue circles, even informal ones, let players process and share. Whether joy, grief, or relief, mechanics and pacing should support emotional rhythm, making the story feel impactful and complete. Storytelling through mechanics is all about harnessing the power of game rules to enhance the narrative impact of a tabletop role-playing game. As we've seen, key concepts like Ludonarrative Harmony remind us to align those rules with our story's themes, while ideas like Emergent narratives celebrate the spontaneous stories that well-designed systems can generate. By examining games from Dungeons & Dragons to Apocalypse World, we saw in practice how different mechanics shape the emotional texture of play. Dungeons & Dragons' combat engine and alignment system create a very different vibe than Fate's aspect-driven narrative or Blades in the Dark's stress-fueled tension. There is no one right way to do it. Each system chooses what kind of story it wants to support. But in every case, the magic happens when the rules and the fiction push in the same direction, leading players to feel truly part of a story that they are co-creating. For game designers and game masters, the takeaway is to be intentional. Know what you want your players to feel and what kind of stories you want to tell, and let that inform every mechanic you design or use. If you want heroism and excitement, craft rules that reward bold actions and make victory sweet. If you aim for horror and vulnerability, include mechanics that limit power, enforce consequences, and build dread. If drama and character growth are the focus, use mechanics that highlight relationships, tough choices, and personal arcs. The how-to section we provided offers a roadmap. Set clear goals, avoid dissonant incentives, empower players, embed story into character mechanics, maintain tension with uncertainty. It also reminds us to be mindful of pitfalls like overly punitive rules or complexity that distracts from the story. In essence, good narrative design in tabletop role-playing games requires a balance of structure and freedom. Enough rules to give shape to the story and produce consistency, but not so much that they constrain the imagination or emotional flow. And that wraps up today's episode on designing for impact in tabletop role-playing games. At its heart, this is about blending mechanics and narrative into a single, expressive art form. The rules we use aren't just structure, they're the language of the story itself. With intentional design and thoughtful play, every role, every decision, and every mechanic can become a moment of emotion, drama, or revelation. If you found this video helpful, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to RPG PhD for more deep dives into game design, storytelling, and the psychology of play. And as always, thanks for watching. See you next time.